Chairman Cole.
Chairman, just a couple. First of all, welcome to our guests. It's great to have this crew up here, and want to particularly thank Mr. Ryan for bringing this legislation. I agree very much with your point about these things are effectively permanent. I actually had an example today of a constituent who came in my office complaining about last year's effort where we passed what we knew we were going to pass in December when it was literally too late for that individual to take advantage or to have planned to build this into his business. I have the same problem. We have a couple of provisions in these extender packages that relate to Native Americans. I think there's a coal provision for the Crow. They have, they find out at the end of the year they would have had a tax incentive to develop more coal. It's a little late to do that on December 17th. We have an Indian lands tax credit bill in there that is meant to encourage investment on reservation lands. Again, it's hard to know whether or not you can use it if you don't get it until December and it's retroactive. So this problem is one that, I'd love to see us deal with it in a larger bill. I know all three of you would, but these are cases where we literally know we're going to do them anyway. So I think it's just really silly not to proceed. I would ask you this, Mr. Ryan. I know you're working on a larger package, and I had this discussion with Mr. Camp last year. At some point, we do need to, I assume, you're going to winnow out some of these tax credits. And I do think, I mentioned the ones that concern Native Americans. Those are important to me. I realize there's a constituency for every one of these things. At some point, you have to be honest with people about what's at risk and what's not. And while this is a step in that direction, my friend Mr. Levin makes a good point. So I do think at some point I would hope you put on the table what you envision, what the plan is, because that allows those of us that have concerns in particular areas to have an opportunity to address them. And this approach, we don't have a chance to do that.
We fully intend on doing that because I agree with that. These represent parts of the code that we think ought to be permanent, therefore not go away. And to your point, the reason we're doing it now is because we don't want to end up with something in December. Look, we just made them retroactive to 13, so these provisions have already expired. So we're already in 2015, and we will have to go back to the beginning of the year sometime this year. So we would rather do it now so that we don't have this end of the year problem. That's why we want to do it now, instead of waiting to the end of the year to do it retroactive and start this movie all over again. So, and we do believe that these ought to be permanent, and we don't think we should raise taxes elsewhere just to keep them where they are. And that's why we think this helps us with tax reform, but that's where we just have a difference of opinion on that.
My friend,
But if I might, Mr. Cole, I mean, you raised what the problem is in part because there are other important provisions of the tax extenders that have not been part of this effort on your side, all the energy provisions, the provisions you mentioned, and lots of others. And I think we need to winnow. You don't winnow by picking out certain pieces and making them permanent, especially when it isn't going to happen. Well, it's just. I mean, this statement from the administration should be taken seriously and should spark us to stop this process and sit down and try to work out on a bipartisan basis tax reform. Chairman Camp, I think, essentially said, well, we went through the motions of making some permanent. The only way to do this is to make things permanent that should be permanent and pay for them.
If I may, there's a great deal of that my friend says it's worthy to think about. But actually, when I look at these things, I look at them in different buckets, if you will. There are some that we know are going to be permanent if we ever get to, and these are clearly them.
Right.
They are clearly, yeah. And so the idea of waiting on everything else, I think there's considerable merit to just moving ahead. And sometimes when you actually start moving, then the process can begin. People know that you're serious about it. So I recognize that here. There are other of those provisions that are clearly going to be debatable. There's regional differences. There's philosophic differences. And I don't think you've touched any of those here. I don't see anything here that, frankly, I don't think almost every member would be happy to vote for. The 179 provision in particular is enormously popular with a lot of the small business people I represent, and I assume everybody else represents too. So, again, I'm very pleased with what you're doing. I think if the president is going to issue veto threats, I think he'd be well advised to start telling us. I have no doubt we're going to see what your total plan is. I've worked with you on the Budget Committee, and you put at considerable political risk to yourselves, and then persuaded all the rest of us to join you. You know, some things on the table that were very controversial, but you put them out there in detail, and you know, where we had a chance to look at the whole thing and make a judgment. And I'm very pleased that the House on 4 different occasions passed your budget. I have no doubt you'll do the same thing on the tax issue. So I would just urge you to keep pushing that. And again, well, the president, you know, I will disagree with my friend from Michigan here a little bit and give you a chance to respond. It's pretty easy to issue these kind of threats. This kind of legislation reaches your desk, I think it's going to be awfully hard to veto, because I suspect if it ever got to his desk, it would get there with large bipartisan majorities. Because again, these things are pretty popular, pretty straightforward. My friend, the chairman, is right. We should have a long time ago made these part of the permanent feature, in my view. But anyway, I thank all of you for being here. I look forward. I think I know the outcome on the floor, and be very proud to vote for these particular measures again. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.